In a quiet neighborhood, Michael's life seemed ordinary from the outside. But behind closed doors, years of emotional pain and constant turmoil were building up. Michael's father, Frank, had always been harsh, but over the years, his anger grew worse. What started as small arguments turned into daily verbal abuse, leaving scars that couldn't be seen. No one on the outside knew what was happening, but Michael's breaking point was coming. On a cold evening, after a particularly brutal argument, everything changed. Michael had tried for years to please his father, to escape the anger and insults. But this time, something snapped. In that moment, a son's years of silent suffering turned into an unimaginable act. What led Michael to take such a final, tragic step? Frank's lifeless body was found in the family home. The scene was shocking, but what was more surprising was learning the story behind the murder. Neighbors and friends were left in disbelief, wondering how a seemingly normal family could hide such deep pain. Police arrived quickly, and Officer Daniels began piecing together the chilling events of that night. This story isn't just about a crime, it's about the silent suffering that can live in families, hidden behind smiles and closed doors. As we dive into the details of that fateful night, we will see how years of emotional abuse led to a tragic ending that no one saw coming. The real question remains what pushed Michael to finally fight back, and was there any way it could have been stopped? Now, we turn to the events that unfolded on that tragic evening, where a broken family reached its devastating conclusion. Michael's life had been a series of dark days stretching back to his childhood. His father, Frank, was a man of intense mood swings, often taking his frustrations out on his son. For years, Michael bore the brunt of this abuse. It started with harsh words and constant criticism, and as time went on, it became a near-daily barrage of insults and belittlement. Frank's rage was unpredictable, and the fear Michael felt had shaped him into a timid and quiet young man. At 26 years old, Michael was still living with his father, trapped in a toxic home that offered no escape. Frank was not the father who showed affection or praise. Instead, he was a man who found power and control, using his words as weapons. Neighbors saw Frank as strict, but had no idea how deep the abuse ran behind closed doors. Michael's friends had long drifted away, unable to understand the pressure he lived under. The few that remained had no idea how bad things had gotten, as Michael had learned to hide his pain, knowing that no one could really help him. On a particularly cold winter night, the tension in the house reached its boiling point. Frank had been drinking heavily that day, something that always made his temper worse. Michael, trying to stay out of his way, was in his room when Frank stormed in. What began as a typical shouting match quickly escalated. Years of suppressed anger and emotional wounds resurfaced, turning the confrontation into something far more dangerous. Frank's words were sharper than usual, and for the first time, Michael felt a deep anger rising inside him. He had been pushed too far, for too long. His mind raced with the memories of every insult, every moment he had been made to feel worthless. Something shifted in Michael that night. The fear that had always held him back was replaced by a sense of determination, a decision that tonight it had to end. The pain could not continue. Michael had thought about leaving so many times, but tonight, it was not about leaving, it was about stopping the abuse once and for all. Frank's aggression grew more physical, shoving Michael against the wall, shouting insults that echoed through the house. Michael had never fought back before, but that night, something inside him broke. Years of hurt bubbled to the surface, and in a sudden, irreversible moment, he grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and struck his father with it. Frank collapsed instantly, blood seeping from the wound on his head. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stood frozen, staring at his father's motionless body on the floor. He couldn't process what had just happened. His hands shook, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. The reality of the situation began to sink in slowly. Frank was dead. As Michael stood there, everything felt surreal. The house was eerily quiet now. The storm of violence that had filled it moments before was gone. All that remained was Michael, his father's lifeless body, and the realization that his life had changed forever. There was no going back from what he had just done. The crime scene was something straight out of a nightmare, but for Michael it was the only way he could end the cycle of pain he had endured for so long. He knew the police would come. He knew this would be the end of his life as he knew it. But at that moment, as he looked at Frank's body, there was only one thought in his mind: it was finally over. This was just the beginning of a tragedy that would unravel over the coming hours. Michael had no idea how far-reaching the consequences of that night would be. And as the investigation began, everyone in the town would soon discover the dark and twisted secrets that had been hiding in plain sight. As the silence settled in the aftermath of the fatal blow, Michael remained frozen in shock. The sight of his father's lifeless body on the floor was overwhelming, and the weight of what he had just done crushed him. For years, Michael had been the one taking the blows, enduring the verbal abuse and emotional scars. Now, in an instant, the roles had shifted, and he had become the one who had ended it all. His mind raced, trying to process what had happened, but the reality of the situation was too immense to grasp in the moment. Michael stood over Frank's body for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, and his hands still shaking from the violent outburst. There was no undoing what had been done, no going back to a life where the abuse continued. But in ending Frank's life, Michael had also ended any sense of normalcy in his own. It wasn't just his father's death that hung heavy in the air, it was the complete dismantling of the life he had known. In the immediate aftermath, Michael panicked. His first instinct was to clean up the scene, erase any trace of what had occurred, but the reality of covering up a murder was far more complicated than he could handle. Every move he made felt clumsy and wrong, from trying to move his father's body to attempting to clean the blood from the carpet. The weight of guilt bore down on him, and soon, Michael realized there was no hiding from what he had done. The evidence was too overwhelming, and his mind was too fragile to concoct any believable alibi. Hours passed before Michael mustered the courage to call the police. His voice shook as he spoke, his words broken and incoherent. When the officers arrived, they found a scene of utter devastation. Michael was sitting on the couch, his face pale and his eyes vacant. Frank's body remained where it had fallen, the blood drying on the floor. The officers, having seen countless crime scenes, knew immediately that this was no accident. They quickly assessed the situation and took Michael into custody. The news of Frank's death spread quickly through the small town. He had been well known, though not particularly well liked, by the locals. Many had witnessed his temper and his overbearing personality, though none had imagined it would end in such violence. As the details of the crime emerged, it became clear to everyone that the years of abuse Michael had endured were the catalyst for this tragic outcome. Neighbors who had once viewed Frank as merely strict, now looked back and wondered how they had missed the signs of deeper trouble. As the investigation began, detectives pieced together the events of that fateful night. Michael's account was filled with gaps and confusion, his mind still reeling from the trauma of what he had done. He explained the years of mistreatment, the isolation he felt, and how his father's unrelenting cruelty had pushed him to the breaking point. But while his story gained sympathy from some, the law was clear Michael had committed murder, and there would be consequences. Forensic evidence at the scene corroborated Michael's confession. The lamp he had used to strike his father was found with traces of blood and hair, and the bruising on Frank's body indicated that the attack had been sudden and violent. As the case moved forward, the prosecution built a case around the idea of a premeditated act, arguing that Michael had been pushed, yes, but that he had chosen to end his father's life in cold blood. The defense, however, painted a different picture, one of a young man driven to the edge by years of abuse, a victim who had finally snapped under the weight of his trauma. As Michael's trial approached, the public divided over whether to view him as a victim or a killer. Some believed that he had been pushed too far, that Frank's abuse had left him with no other option. Others felt that, no matter the provocation, taking a life was unforgivable. The tension in the courtroom would soon reflect the internal struggle Michael had felt for years, a fight between justice and survival. As Michael sat in the interrogation room, the full weight of his actions began to settle in. The police had processed the scene, taken photographs, and collected forensic evidence, but now came the hard part, unraveling what had truly happened that night. The detectives assigned to the case, seasoned in their roles, could tell that Michael wasn't a typical killer. He didn't fit the profile of someone who had planned a murder, and yet his father's body lay lifeless in the family home. This was not an open and shut case. Detectives Robinson and Hughes sat across from Michael, their expressions stern but not unkind. They had reviewed the crime scene and knew there was more to the story. Frank's history of abuse was well known among neighbors, but it had never escalated to this level, at least not publicly. Michael's entire demeanor in the interrogation room spoke of a broken man, not a cold-blooded murderer. But, as with every case, the law required a clear recounting of the facts, and it was up to Michael to provide them. The questioning started slowly, with the detectives asking about Michael's relationship with his father. They needed to understand the dynamic between the two men, particularly in the weeks leading up to the murder. Michael, his voice shaky and his eyes hollow, began to recount years of pent-up anger, sadness, and emotional trauma. He told them about the constant berating, the insults, and the isolation his father had imposed on him. Over time, the abuse became his normal, and he had accepted it as a fact of his life. But something had changed recently. Michael felt like he was suffocating, and the pressure had reached a boiling point. In the days leading up to the murder, Michael's father had become more unpredictable. His temper flared more often, and his words cut deeper. That night, Frank's anger had been triggered by a seemingly minor disagreement. It escalated quickly, as it had many times before, but this time Michael didn't back down. The words exchanged between father and son were filled with venom, a lifetime of resentment surfacing in that heated moment. In a blind rage, Michael struck his father with the nearest object, a lamp. Frank's body fell to the floor, lifeless. The detectives listened intently, noting every detail. They understood that Michael's actions, while horrifically violent, were born out of desperation. But the law was clear: murder was murder, regardless of motive. As the investigation deepened, the detectives needed to verify Michael's account of the events. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members, all of whom confirmed what Michael had said about his father's abusive nature. It was common knowledge that Frank was a difficult man to be around, but no one had ever expected it to end like this. The autopsy report came back, confirming that Frank had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The evidence supported Michael's confession, and the case seemed straightforward in terms of the physical facts. However, the emotional and psychological aspects of the crime made it more complicated. Michael wasn't a career criminal or someone with a violent past. He was a victim of years of emotional abuse, and this was a crime of passion, not premeditation. As the days turned into weeks, the case against Michael became clearer. While the police and prosecution were sympathetic to his plight, they were bound by the law. A life had been taken, and there had to be consequences. But as the defense prepared for trial, they focused on the years of torment Michael had endured at the hands of his father. The goal was to paint a picture of a young man pushed to his breaking point, someone who had acted out of fear and desperation rather than malice. The media quickly picked up on the case, framing it as a tragedy of a broken family. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed Michael as a victim who had finally snapped, while others believed that no amount of abuse justified taking a life. The courtroom would soon become the battleground for these opposing views, with both sides fighting to define Michael's future. The defense strategy was clear. They would argue that Michael had acted in self-defense, not in the physical sense but in an emotional one. They wanted the jury to see that this wasn't just about a violent outburst, but about the years of torment that led up to it. On the other hand, the prosecution aimed to prove that, no matter the circumstances, murder could not be excused. Michael had made a choice, and now he had to face the consequences. As Michael sat in his jail cell, waiting for the trial to begin, he couldn't help but reflect on how things had spiraled so far out of control. He had never intended for any of this to happen, but the events of that night were irreversible. The only thing left to do was to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult they would be. The stage was set for a trial that would test not only Michael's fate but also the boundaries of what people considered justifiable in the face of extreme emotional abuse. The truth, as always, would lie somewhere between the facts and the emotions surrounding them. Michael's trial began in a small courtroom, packed with reporters and curious onlookers. It was the kind of case that captivated the public's attention, blending themes of family turmoil, emotional abuse, and tragic violence. The air was tense, every eye in the room fixed on Michael as he sat quietly next to his defense attorney. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he awaited the fate that would soon be decided. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They described the brutal attack, painting Michael as a violent and unpredictable individual who had crossed a line that no one could ignore. They didn't deny the history of abuse that had come to light during the investigation, but they argued that it didn't justify murder. They played up the shock of a son killing his own father, highlighting the brutality of the crime and the finality of the crime and the finality of Michael's actions. Their goal was clear. They wanted the jury to see Michael as a danger to society, someone who couldn't be trusted to control his anger. The defense, on the other hand, took a very different approach. They presented Michael as a victim himself, someone who had endured years of emotional torment at the hands of his father. They brought in family members, neighbors, and even a few of Michael's old friends to testify about Frank's temper and the emotional toll it had taken on Michael over the years. The defense attorney worked hard to frame the crime as a moment of extreme emotional distress, arguing that Michael had acted out of fear and desperation after years of suffering in silence. They wanted the jury to see him not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a young man who had reached his breaking point after enduring more than anyone should have to bear. Throughout the trial, both sides presented their evidence, but it was the testimonies that had the most impact. Family members described a toxic home environment, one where Michael had been verbally abused and controlled for as long as they could remember. Neighbors added their observations, recalling how Frank would berate his son in public, and how Michael seemed to shrink under the weight of his father's constant criticisms. The picture that emerged was not one of a typical father-son relationship, but one of deep dysfunction and emotional manipulation. The prosecution, however, countered with evidence from the crime scene. Photos of the blood-stained carpet, the broken lamp, and the bruises on Frank's body were presented to the jury. They reminded everyone that no matter what the circumstances, a life had been taken, and that was a line that couldn't be crossed without consequences. They also emphasized that Michael had options. He could have walked away, called the police, or sought help. Instead, he had chosen violence. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the fact that a man had died at the hands of his own son. They argued that Michael's actions were deliberate, that he had made a choice in that moment to end his father's life. They emphasized that no amount of emotional abuse could justify such an extreme act. The defense, in contrast, asked the jury to consider the years of torment Michael had endured. They argued that this wasn't a case of a premeditated murder, but rather the tragic result of years of emotional pain finally reaching a breaking point. They asked the jury to show compassion, to understand that Michael had been pushed to the edge by his father's cruelty. The jury was sent to deliberate, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Hours passed as the jurors debated the fate of the young man sitting in the defendant's chair. Outside, reporters speculated on the outcome, with some believing that Michael would be convicted of second-degree murder, while others thought he might be acquitted due to the extreme emotional circumstances of the case. Inside his holding cell, Michael waited, reflecting on the events that had led him here. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him, but so did the years of pain he had suffered at his father's hands. He knew he couldn't take back what had happened, but he hoped that the jury would understand the impossible situation he had found himself in that night. Finally, the jury returned, and the room fell silent as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The courtroom was tense as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. Michael sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his mind racing through every possible outcome. His attorney whispered to him, but the words barely registered. All that mattered now was what the jury had decided. The room fell silent as the judge asked for the verdict. The foreman stood up, cleared his throat, and delivered the words that would change Michael's life forever. He was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The jury had taken into account the years of emotional abuse, the torment that had driven Michael to the breaking point. They believed that while he had acted with deadly force, it wasn't out of malice or cruelty, but a desperate reaction to years of suffering. The courtroom let out a collective breath. It was not the worst outcome, but it wasn't a full acquittal either. Michael's future still hung in the balance, but the charge carried a lighter sentence than the prosecution had originally sought. The judge began to explain the sentencing process, and while Michael's family sat in silent relief, there was no escaping the fact that a life had been lost. Frank's death, no matter how troubled he had been, was still a tragedy. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the case, recognizing the emotional abuse but also emphasizing that taking a life could never be excused. The sentence was handed down minus 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Michael's head sank. It was more than he had hoped for, but far less than what he had feared. As Michael was led out of the courtroom, his mother wept quietly, torn between her love for her son and the grief for her husband, flawed as he had been. The family was left to grapple with the consequences, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. Frank's death had left a void in their lives, and Michael's imprisonment was another blow they had to endure. The emotional scars from years of conflict were deep, and now the entire family was fractured, left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Over the next few months, the case continued to capture headlines. Discussions on emotional abuse and its impact on mental health took center stage, with some calling for more awareness and resources for those trapped in toxic family dynamics. Michael's case was often cited as an example of how emotional and psychological torment could push someone to extreme actions. But while the conversations outside the prison walls shifted, Michael's reality remained unchanged. He adjusted to life in prison, attending therapy sessions, and reflecting on the events that had led him there. He was determined to change, but the weight of his actions never fully left him. Inside, he wrestled with the guilt of having taken his father's life. Despite the years of abuse, the fact remained that Frank was his father. The memory of that night haunted him, how everything had happened so quickly, the fear and anger that had overwhelmed him, and the moment when he realized he had gone too far. It was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Frank's death had a ripple effect on the family. His estranged siblings came forward with their own stories of childhood abuse, casting a new light on the family's troubled past. Some saw Michael's actions as the tragic culmination of a legacy of trauma, while others could not forgive him for taking a life, no matter the circumstances. The family gatherings became rare, filled with tension and unspoken pain. The events of that night had left a permanent mark, and no one knew how to move forward. As the years passed, Michael remained hopeful for parole, but he knew that nothing would erase what had happened. The media coverage of the trial gradually faded, but for those involved, the memory of the crime never did. Michael's mother, now living alone, visited him often in prison, her visits bittersweet. She had lost her husband and her son in one night, and her sorrow was a constant reminder of the price they had all paid. In the end, the story of Michael and Frank became more than just a tale of a murder. It was a story of the devastating effects of emotional abuse, how unchecked pain and anger can destroy lives from the inside. The community that had once been shocked by the crime now saw it as a tragedy born of years of hidden suffering. Michael's name became synonymous with the dangers of emotional abuse, a stark reminder that sometimes the most destructive forces are the ones we can't see. As Michael marked another year behind bars, he thought about the future, about the possibility of parole, and about what life would look like when he was eventually released. He knew that freedom would not come easily, and that the scars from his past would follow him wherever he went. But for now, all he could do was wait, hoping that one day he would be able to find peace, if not forgiveness.